Hello and welcome. In this podcast, we are discussing speaking truth to power, engaging with stakeholders, and influencing policy. A key feature that distinguishes a policy research think tank from an academic organization is policy engagement. A think tank's work remains incomplete if their research does not reach critical stakeholders. It succeeds when it's able to initiate an informed policy and make changes for a better society. I'm Shramana from C-Step Bangalore, and in this podcast, think tanks from South Asia who were a part of the Think Tank Initiative share their experience with regards to influencing policy, the divide, the challenges, and various means of engagement. To give you a context, the Think Tank Initiative was conceived to strengthen independent policy research institutions in developing countries for more evidence based policy making. It was created in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the UK Department for International Development, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and the International Development Research Centre IDRC, Canada. 14 think tanks from South Asia were selected for Phase 2 of the initiative in 2008. The work of these think tanks spanned across research areas such as climate change and energy resource management, education, primary health, and livelihood. They received co-funding and dedicated capacity development to improve their research methods and skills, such as policy engagement, communications, and general organizational effectiveness. As think tanks documented the journey with the Think Tank Initiative, one area where the initiative's impact was deeply felt was policy engagement. Here we're discussing the shift in perspectives to policy engagement with the executive directors of some of the think tanks in the TTI network. We also have with us from IDRC, Seema Bhatia Panthaki and Shannon Sutton, senior program officers with the Think Tank Initiative. Okay, let's get straight to the discussion. Seema, the think tank ecosystem in South Asia is a developing one as opposed to think tanks in, say, the US or the UK. Do you see any difference in the way think tanks function here? And how does this play out in terms of impacting policy?
Firstly, the way in which we conceptualize the idea of think tanks in the global south, as it were, is very different from how think tanks function in the global north, particularly in the US, where there's almost like a revolving door between think tanks and government policymakers. This works out in many, many different ways in South Asia.
Can you also elaborate on the challenges they're facing?
Work needs to happen on two sides because there are two players here. There's an audience here, which is the government, but there's also the think tanks that have to provide that kind of evidence to governments and other constituents indeed. In terms of what think tanks can do, obviously, they need to have the right kind of information at the right time in the right place. Now, this is hard to do because you don't really know what policies will surface as important at a particular time. But as and when you build thematic capacity, this becomes apparent. There's almost an existential challenge for think tanks between producing policy relevant research, being able to publish this in academic journals. And, often publications in academic journals are held up as the benchmark for good quality research. But this may not necessarily be applicable for policymakers. So it's important in terms of the kind of work that is produced by think tanks, the right kind of work, which targets a particular audience, be it a policymaker, be it a bureaucrat, be it a political constituency or a community, that the right information is provided in the right way and at the right time.
Dushni Virakun, you lead a semi-governmental think tank in Sri Lanka, the Institute of Policy Studies. Having worked with the government so closely, where do you place think tanks in South Asia? Do you think they play an important role?
If you look at the overall policy making process in South Asia and in my country, in Sri Lanka, key sort of perception is that institutional structures are very weak in our countries. There is no rational basis on which policies are made. Sometimes they are made simply on the basis of getting a few extra votes. And in that context, I think there is a great demand for good quality research to at least try and inform and educate the policymakers about what they ought to do and what they ought not to do. And one thing is that I think again in the South Asian region there is limited research capacity at the universities, and perhaps that's a reason why think tanks have grown in numbers across, I think, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, all these countries. And they provide a healthy platform for at least raising some questions, generating a public discussion around that, getting the media engaged in this discussion. And even if the policymakers are not listening and using that evidence, at least there is a sense of what they ought to have done. So in some sense, a benchmarking of good policies and bad policies. So to that extent, I believe that think tanks do have an important role, and for a region like South Asia, it's perhaps even more critical that more such think tanks operate.
In today's global context of the internet and information being at your fingertips, do we really need to engage at all? What roles can think tanks play? Yamini Iyer from Center for Policy Research and Dr. Sultan Hafiz from the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development explain engagement in this context.
The art of policy making is an extremely complex exercise, and it is getting increasingly more complex in the 21st century, where governance is not just an action that is produced by a group of bureaucrats and their political masters. There are multiple pulls and pressures that come on to governments. The world of policy making and the world of governance is becoming increasingly more complex, increasingly more technical, and it needs a whole set of stakeholders to contribute. Think tanks are one important stakeholder in this melody of stakeholders that democratic societies have, from citizens and their conduit civil society organizations to organized lobbying. And the critical role that think tanks play, which no other stakeholder plays, is in the ability to pass through the noise by focusing on rigorous research and using rigorous research to put facts and evidence on the table. And through these facts and evidence, frame the parameters of the conversation and push the envelope of the policy-making debate, both by providing technical advice, but also by asking those critical hard questions that governments don't have the luxury to ask, or frankly the time or space to do so.
Policy engagement is important for think tanks. Well, it's the lifeblood of think tanks. This is their business, doing policy research. If they do the policy research, and the research sits on shelves, that doesn't help very much. Think tanks are much more aligned to social change. So they would like to see conditions, the human condition, change in their societies and their countries. That's why they do policy analysis.
So Shannon, why do you think it's important for think tanks to engage with stakeholders? And who should they engage with?
Policy engagement is essential for think tanks in general, because beyond the rigorous research that they're undertaking, rooted in local realities, they're also positioning that research for use and impact. So along with undertaking the research, they're thinking about how they're going to get their findings into the hands of the people who can use them. And often that requires outreach to a diverse variety of stakeholders. So examples might include a high-level policymakers and other officials within government, the private sector, local businesses, working with civil society organizations and activists.
So engagement is key for a think tank. But does it affect the kind of research that think tanks engage in? Should it?
Policy engagement is equally important. After all, that's why we are all think tanks and not universities. But it's important to caution a little bit in that policy engagement is a crucial goal, but it should not be the mechanism that shapes what you do as an institution. What you do as an institution should be to identify what your core areas of speciality are, areas of research are, and what are ways in which you can speak truth to power. The quality of what you do itself then becomes the mechanism and the means through which we engage with policy. So when we say policy engagement, I think what we should mean as think tanks is that we should do research and engage with our research in a way that is relevant to the policy making community, but we should most certainly not let the policy pace of the time shape what we do as organizations. We should be driving it, not them driving us.
So, how do we ensure that policymakers take up recommendations by think tanks? Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj of the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy and Ajay Dikshit from Institute of Social and Environmental Transition, Nepal, elaborate this for us.
Even if research quality is good, the research to policy connect, that is often missing. Often researchers think that just by doing a good piece of research, their job is done. But that's not even half done, because it has to be conveyed to the stakeholder in a manner that he or she understands. So in that sense, I think Indian think tanks in general, again my caveat, with specific honorable exceptions, we have a long way to go. We are just one of the voices in shaping policy. So we have to be realistic in our expectations. We can't expect that everything which we are saying will be adopted by policymakers. So let's be realistic on that count. We are just one of the voices.
Since there are so many other actors also involved in the policy arena, you are one among the many, so you cannot say what I have done has influenced policy, but what you can say is what you have done is to become part of the discourse. You influence some thinking, and then as a part of that thinking there will be some policy actions and changes. So we are part of that process.
Engaging requires patience and a lot of long process to understand. It's a mutual give and take. So we go with our work as researchers. The policymakers are the ones who are faced with day-to-day challenges. They are the ones who are answerable to public, not we. And therefore they know ground realities much better than we do. So therefore ensuring our work is implementable is a mutual understanding, mutual give and take process.
The central point is to ensure that you become honest to the problem that you are investigating. The assumptions become very, very important. If you recognize those assumptions are being critical, and then to use the knowledge that you produce as kind of a means of conversation. And the idea, I think, of having a think tank is to promote this idea of conversation and negotiation. For if we can begin to get into that framing of mind, hopefully we get into again this idea of a constructive conversation, constructive dialogue with critical insight in place, not compromising your sort of integrity and the objectivity of the research and the organization.
But what happens when a think tank's perspective is different from the government's? How do think tanks engage in this case? Gurucharan Singh, what are your thoughts on this, given your experience in leading the Public Affairs Center?
Principal challenge in policy engagement is to ensure that governments do not see it as adversarial engagement. It is often the case that a think tank's view might be different from that of the government. And I think the ability to succeed in policy engagement is in transforming this difference of opinion into what I would describe as equitable adversarial engagement, where the think tank is able to sit with the government and point out that the difference is one of principle, and that the civil society organization's perspective is important for the government to improve the quality of its praxis.
Policy engagement is not easy. It takes time and effort and can often be a frustrating process when the response is not as expected. However, there are successful stories of influence. Anshu, can you tell us what enabled the success from C-STEP's experience?
We are very happy that in the last 8-10 years we have several illustrations where our work has led to policy changes. I won't get into specifics, but they're broadly in the area of energy, climate space, and also in material space, more recently in electric vehicles also. The point I want to highlight is, most of our policy impact examples can be attributed to core grants. And I say that for 2 or 3 important reasons. See, we work on a project, and through project we develop knowledge in that area. But that may or may not lead to immediate policy outcome, because policy engagement is a complex process. It requires continuous engagement with the policymaker. The policymakers may get transferred. Sometimes government's priorities might change. So it needs continuous engagement even beyond the duration of a project. And that's where core grants are important, because we can continue to engage with them only using core money.
Think tanks also have to keep their ears on the ground and be aware of the changing political and societal dynamics in the areas they work in, says Dr. Khalida Gauss from Social Policy and Development Center.
Previously, what we used to do is, because there was a culture of making use of the and going through and reading the research reports, so there was never such need. And invariably they would go through it and send us the acknowledgements and the comments and everything. Now that culture is eroding very rapidly. So now you actually need to get into contact with them physically, to talk to them. And that needs to be done. You need to get in touch with the legislators. So their capacity needs to be built. We do in smaller groups, we do bring them on board, try to build their understanding on and about that issue. We continue to not only produce the research, but taking it right from the top level to the civil society level by translating it into the local languages where it is understood not only by the parliamentarians, by the other civil society organizations, and at the lower tier of the government, that is the local government.
In the current context, Yamini, what are the ways in which the multiple stakeholders are informed of the relevant policy research the think tanks are engaged in?
Very importantly, by engaging consistently and continuously in public debate. And we have many tools through which we do that. One commonly used tool is through the mainstream media. Writing in newspapers, engaging in debates and dialogues on television are very commonly used tools that think tanks across the world have now adopted. But I think also much more importantly, finding ways of taking our ideas across a whole diverse range of the community. There is, after all, no such thing as a community, especially in societies as complex as ours in South Asia. So building collaborations with civil society organizations, potentially building collaborations with movements. One of the interesting things that the Center for Policy Research does, we do a lot of high-level policy thinking and interaction with national governments, but we also work at the state government. Most importantly, we also have some of our projects that are working very closely at the district level and below, engaging in conversations, ideas, seminars at that level too, I think is a very, very important way of taking ideas to places where they matter, and most importantly of keeping it real for all of us, because it's one thing to sit in your air-conditioned offices in ivory towers in New Delhi. It's a very different thing to engage with precisely those ideas in a rural village in Bihar. It helps us fine-tune what we are thinking, and it helps us, I think, in many ways articulate policy in a much more meaningful and effective way.
Shannon, other than policy recommendations, what do think tanks have to consider in the process of policy engagement? And how have think tanks in South Asia demonstrated policy change through engagements with stakeholders?
Feedback from activists is as important as feedback from peer review. So a reminder that it's not just about conducting the research, but actually ensuring that it's relevant to the society that the research intends to impact. So in some of our work at TTI, we've seen great examples of how think tanks are working in terms of both their research and in some cases their advocacy efforts to get these issues onto the agendas of people who can then implement them, put them into action. And we have one great example from the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability in India, where they're conducting research on effective healthcare services and how these services contribute to healthcare equity. And to do that, they examine gaps in government programs for the country's Muslims, which is the largest minority group in India. And their policy recommendations included a multi-sectoral development program for ministries that was presented to the Prime Minister of India. So quite a high-level policy engagement opportunity for that organization. And this led to concrete policy change, increased funding, and greater access to public service for over 100 million Muslims in India. Another example, quite an innovative one, involves a car rally between 4 countries. This was undertaken by the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. They called it the BCIM Corridor Rally, the K2K, and they invited high-level policymakers to participate at the finish line to celebrate this event and how it had really illustrated the importance of connection between the regions. They also reached out to ministers, business leaders, investors, entrepreneurs, and members of civil society. So another example of how think tanks are often working with a diverse variety of stakeholders. And by engaging in advocacy that kept the issue on the policy agenda, they were able to highlight the importance of moving this agenda forward, and it led to the establishment of a BCIM economic corridor, and an MOU has since been signed to move forward with that agenda.
So, having worked with these think tanks in South Asia for the last few years, do you think the ecosystem for think tanks is evolving? What are some of the challenges that still need addressing?
On the side of the governments, there is appetite, and there is growing appetite, we've seen this, for evidence on what works and what doesn't, because policies shape not just the way in which outcomes are going to manifest today, but also in the future. And as publics are asking for accountability from the government, this is going to play a very important part. So I think that policymakers are increasingly recognizing the importance of evidence. However, it also means that they require the sort of training to understand, access, and implement the evidence when they're thinking about policies that they are designing at the moment. Especially at the implementation stage, we have great policies on paper, and we've seen that time and time and over again, and think tanks have made a significant contribution in this. However, when it comes out to rolling out policies, that's often where things fail and fall apart. And the use of evidence, continuous monitoring and evaluation is important for policymakers to think about. And I think that's going to require a lot more sensitization and training.
We have stories from within the Think Tank Initiative of think tanks who have done incredible work, spent years conducting high-quality research, effectively engaging with policymakers and other relevant stakeholders, only to experience, say, a shift in government and see their issue fall off the agenda. But we feel it's important to tell those stories as well, because there are certain factors that are beyond everyone's control, and think tanks often face challenges in terms of aligning the work they're doing with current day interests. But in order to remain relevant, it is essential that they stay well connected to government agendas and the needs of diverse stakeholders, including civil society, activists, the private sector, and other academics. And the think tanks that we work with in South Asia all do this incredibly effectively by investing a substantial amount of their time in policy engagement efforts and assessing those efforts to ensure that they're having their intended impact. And as a result, we see many stories of success where think tanks are really making an impact in their societies.
Thank you, Shannon, for summing up the discussion. Think tanks in South Asia are emerging as one of the key stakeholders in bringing about significant changes and awareness to the civil society. Thank you for listening. That was the podcast Speaking Truth to Power, engaging with stakeholders and influencing policy.